Thank you so very much, Sir Gluckman, for this very insightful speech.
I want to zoom in on one comment you made. You made the comment that the academy sometimes struggle to show their competence, their independence, and then at the same time being helpful. So I'm just curious if you see a tension in general between being truly helpful and being truly independent.
Hello, I just wanted to ask, with the creation of the Chief Science Advisor position in Canada, you emphasized a lot of the idea of creating this trust and building trust, particularly with a number of different stakeholder groups. How would you advise them to build that trust relationship with the public?
Well, I think to answer the second question first, because Mark's question is actually a very complex question, trust, I think, depends on not being arrogant. I think that's the first thing. I think the more that we show that science is part of the story, but we've got to be cognizant of all those other domains that the politicians need to consider, but the public are also considering all the time, their own perceptions of situation. I think the public has got sick and cynical about claims that we've cured cancer for the 57th time, that if you just do this, obesity will be addressed, etc., etc., etc. I think the public is much wiser than that. I think trust depends very much on the way the science advisor speaks. So, for example, take genetic modification. Genetically modified foods, a particularly contentious issue in my country. I was pleased when, at a meeting recently, one of the great commentators on science, Roger Pilker, pointed out, I've been listening to Peter Gluckman for 5 years, and I still don't know what he actually thinks about genetically modified foods. Because my point is, I can advise what the science is around the safety of GM foods. Not quite open, there's no evidence that they're not safe. But that just because I say they're safe doesn't mean that's what the government should do, is by promoting the growing of genetically modified crops. That's a whole set of other decisions, which is for the public and the government on behalf of the public to make, how their perception is of the big food industry, how the perception is of interfering with nature, etc., etc., etc. Now, I'm just using that as a microcosm of the point that if I avoid demonstrating hubris, that I know the answer, I know the science, and I'm also not afraid to say I don't know, and how many scientists are afraid to say I don't know, and I also avoid, when I'm talking to anybody, more research is needed. There's always more money research needed, but if the second I conflate the discussion over the science, which is needed for decision making, with an argument for I'm really lobbying for more money for science, and we definitely need more money for science in New Zealand, I lose that trust. So it's all about understanding what, as a broker, you're there to do, and not exceeding that role by becoming an advocate. Individual scientists can be advocates. All scientists are advocates for their areas. My area of science is the most important. It should have funding increased 57 times. That's not the point. It's what I am doing, and I'm trying to show the government, I am trying to show everybody I am not the government in drag. I'm not trying to argue I know better than the Prime Minister. I'm trying to show, and that is a really important part of the story. In terms of Mark's question, let's be honest, there's no complete independence. The science community is funded ultimately by the taxpayer. Ultimately, and it's not doing it just to be a public good, it's doing it because that knowledge is ultimately of value to society in some ways. So I think the point about independence is not that you're entirely independent of society. That's the whole point of the post-normal paradigm. I think the point is more that you're using an independence and sets of processes to acknowledge those biases and where those biases come from and manage them appropriately. But to go to that philosophical independence, complete independence, it's just not possible to do it. And so I think just like not every bit of science, virtually all science is funded by somebody. And all scientists want to get refunded. So you end up in this situation. It's the processes you use, the peer review. All my reports, if they're a formal report, are independently peer reviewed. And that's not everything I write, obviously. That's to do with what I'm talking about if I'm asked to give a deliberative report on something, that's peer review. It's the processes you use. And for the academies, of course, they have very good processes for demonstrating that independence of thought. It's independence of thought that you're really interested in, not independence of structure.
One question from each microphone. Margaret, you go ahead.
Margaret McQuaig Johnston of ISSP. And the real crux of big public policy decisions happen at the cabinet table. And what the cabinet ministers see and read and prepare for those public policy decisions is in the cabinet paper system. It's in the requirement for what is included in that, not a 100-page document, but 10 to 30 pages, including annexes. And there's always a struggle in the central agencies as to what are the requirements for the memoranda to cabinet. Is there a section on environmental impact? Is there something on federal-provincial relations? What's the evidence and the science behind the public policy options? I wonder if you can tell us a bit about, from your own experience, what's important in how science and evidence is included. And it's critical not just for the day that cabinet is making the decision, but what goes into those documents is negotiated in advance through interdepartmental meetings, discussions with central agencies, and so on.
That's a sufficiently important question. I'd like to answer that question now. That, of course, is why you need people internal to the system. That's why you have departmental science advisors in the UK or New Zealand system. It's why you have a chief science advisor who probably who might get a look. The important point you made is you need people in the system from the first brainstorming about policy situations. You can say, science can help you here. Would you like a report here? Would you like that there? The science advisors, we have science advisors now in the 9 major departments of government. They act as a committee, they report, I chair it. It also has the chief economist and the chief statistician as members of that group, plus a senior member of the civil service. It works in 2 major clusters now, a cluster around the social sector and a cluster around the natural resource sector, and I think soon a cluster around infrastructure. And an awful lot of cross-departmental discussion happens in those places. And of course, there are the people who can say and scream and yell if they think the science is being misinterpreted into the policy papers. Now, the British Cabinet Manual some years ago experimented with a line within the Cabinet paper that said, is this in accord with the evidence? And if not, explain why not. That failed rather rapidly as an approach, but we've had a couple of episodes, which I won't detail because here, where the ministers are now have asked that the scientific advice be specific and identified as within the cabinet paper or attached to the cabinet paper. And our new Prime Minister English, is actually very strong about this. So I imagine that over time, particularly in the more contentious areas, we'll see an increasing number of examples of where science advice is attached to the cabinet paper as a 1-paragraph summary or something like that and kept separate. The other situation which is emerging, and again I have to be careful because we have a new government, is a couple of areas the ministers will sit down directly with the science advisors, with or without officials, for a chat and explore the issues directly on particularly contentious issues.
That's pretty cool. Thank you very much.
It's a whole lot of informality. And my point is that's why you need science advisors, because that's not going to be done by an academy from the outside. They're not going to have that access. The number of times, and again, that a senior member of the Cabinet Office the Department of Prime Minister Cabinet said, Peter, would you look at this cabinet paper? We're not comfortable with it. Do you have a view on it? It happens every week. Doesn't say I can do much, but at least I can at least give them input of what I think is the problem.
Ezra Miller, and I'm a consultant to the federal government on science and technology issues. I have a question related to the training of scientists. And that is, very often they can go through their entire training without any background in the social sciences. And I'm thinking how useful it might be when a scientist finds him or herself in a policy-related position to have some economic background related to such concepts as cost-benefit, shadow pricing, social cost, life cycle cost, things like that. Do you think there's a need for that?
Yes. I mean, what we've done, what I'm doing at the moment in New Zealand, because I'm actually advocating that our universities need to think at the master's level at least of some coursework for those in science, but I haven't won that battle yet. Universities are the most conservative organisations on the planet, in my experience. Is we've set up our version of the Canadian Science Policy Exchange, but a bit differently. 30 in Auckland, 30 in Wellington, who actually are a mixture of scientists and policy makers at a young stage in their career, more as a training experience rather than actually, that's its primary role, but they actually also to give input into my office from a younger generation.
Thank you.
My name is Peter McKinnon. I'm associated with our Faculty of Engineering and the Telfer Business School here at the University of Ottawa. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Sir Peter.
I'm sorry I was a bit tired and read too much of it.
Well, I have a question related to your sort of your evidence. It struck me that much of what you were talking about was kind of the evidence coming from Western-style governments and institutions. I'm just wondering if you have an opinion about sort of a bicameral view of the rise of science and technology in China, India, Japan, and much of Asia, in fact, where some of these social issues you stressed don't seem to be as prevalent there.
I'm not so sure. I actually direct a laboratory in Singapore still, and I can tell you that I think many of these issues apply there. I think the cultural, Western view of those cultures sometimes hides what's actually going on there, and because that presents differently. But when I talk to my Chinese, my Japanese colleagues, my Indonesian, my Thai colleagues, these same sets of issues apply. They have a different place because they're in a different state of economic development, some of them. But I don't think you would find going to China any less concern over many of the same sorts of issues. The dynamic in the post-truth world may not be the same yet, but it's emerging, certainly in Singapore.
Well, I do write about science and technology in China, and I've lived there, and I haven't found that experience to the same level as you've described. It could be a timing issue, but thank you very much.
Okay, I don't agree. But Daryl, hi.
Hi, Peter. Daryl Copeland. I'm a former Canadian diplomat and lately have been writing and teaching a lot about international science and technology and science diplomacy. Peter, the topic of your address today, science advice in a troubled world, I'm thinking about the troubled world part and reflecting on the fact that so many of the issues that people in foreign ministries are dealing with have in common a major S&T dimension. So whether it's climate or biodiversity or weapons of mass destruction or non-proliferation or what have you, huge science and technological content in it, and these are very non-traditional issues for people with a background in diplomacy and international relations to be grappling with, tend to be more comfortable with territorial disputes and ideological competition and international treaty law and so on. So about the need for science advice in foreign ministries and your role doing that in New Zealand, could you offer us some insight on the difference between offering that kind of advice to people in central agencies like prime ministers or presidents and people that work in foreign ministries and indeed the foreign ministers themselves? have you come across any kind of fundamental distinction in those two functions?
Well, I think in general, if I can separate that question into two parts, I think there's a generality that clearly when you go from working for the whole of government at the level of Prime Minister or President to working for a ministry, by definition you're getting to more specific issues. I mean, most policy issues actually sit within a ministry or a cluster of ministries rather than with the Prime Minister. And therefore departmental science advisory mechanisms become very important. And if I looked at what my departmental science advisors are doing, they tend to be more the ones doing the more technical reports on water quality or whatever than the kind of broad-brushed advice I am giving. When it comes to foreign ministries, I think the problem's been the framing. I think the traditional language of science diplomacy has not been utilitarian enough for the foreign ministry to understand what it means. Therefore, if you talk about the science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, as you know, the average foreign ministry guy, their eyes will glaze over. It doesn't actually mean anything for them. So what I've been working on is a more utilitarian framing of science diplomacy, so that it actually meets their needs. And if you think about it, it's very simple. The science that foreign ministries need to deal with national interest, be it security, be it economic growth, a relationship that they need to manage or build, the science they need for cross-boundary issues, resources that cross boundaries, conservation issues that cross boundaries, etc., and the science for the global interest, which is SDGs, climate change, so forth, where the UN system is heavily involved. And if you think about it, there's a real set of issues around science advice at that level, but I don't have time to go into it now. And the second I turn it to that framing, national interest, common interest, cross-boundary interest, global interest, the diplomats start to see where they can use science to their advantage. So what I'm writing about now is a more utilitarian framing of science advice. And as you may know, Vaughan and I recently ran a course in Vienna for 22 foreign ministries, not for scientists, but for the diplomats, on the role of science within foreign ministries. Mm-hmm. And again, Vaughan and I are currently writing up some of this stuff at the present time.
First and foremost, by thanking the Canadian Science Policy Centre for seeing fit to host the first lecture here at the University of Ottawa with the Institute for Science, Society and Policy. It has given us great honour and we're so very pleased. Thank you, Mirdad. Thanks to the staff at the ISSP for pulling this together. And last but certainly not least, thank you to Sir Gluckman for an absolutely outstanding talk that not only laid out the definition of the problem, but a real roadmap for how we should go about addressing it. I'd like to invite all of you to join me in thanking Sir Gluckman.